that's what forged our concept of a relationship with God. That's an abusive relationship. I mean, I'm just saying this now without having thought this part through all before, but that's blasphemy. It's okay to be convicted by a sermon that really speaks to you. What's not okay is to be in a place of constant conviction so that you never feel peace with God. You never feel like you can breathe. You never feel like you are worthy of God's love.
That helps me humanize the street corner preacher who tells people you're going to hell if you think of him or her as a fearful person themselves. Wow.
I think a lot of times in conversations, deconstruction gets, it's this big boogeyman right now because people just don't want to believe in God at all. No, there's a difference. Some people are breaking down one and some people are breaking down the other. And this book is designed for people who are deconstructing their faith, but not necessarily God. These questions and doubts and wrestlings are a sign that the Holy Spirit is at work in you and you have not been abandoned, and it is recognizing, it is calling your attention to the fact that your environment is broken.
Have you been tried in the fire?
Well, we're told seek God, and that may mean leave the environment that you're in. Why seek the living with the dead? That's a question we could be asking ourselves. If we are in a church where this abuse is happening, we're probably not going to find Christ there. So let's seek Christ among the living.
The root to this evil, things must change. Risk losing it all if things stay the same. Say la vie, R-I-G, ignite. The life of me is all my peace. We are so elite, up on your feet and stand till all that heat is obsolete. Erase all stigma, I know it's costly. I'm prepared to roommate with John Coffey, yes.
I demanded, pleaded, called God on promises and was like, you have to show up or I am done. And he did.
That's something to really think about. What does it mean that the God of the universe loves me?
Are we saying that our God is bigger than their God, or what?
Man, you got my mind going crazy right now.
I just think that is evangelical bullshit.
And I don't fit in their box anymore. So feeling rejected from the church makes me feel far away from God.
If I'm living out the love of God, love of the divine, then in some ways we're unoffendable.
It's wrong to marginalize anybody for any reason.
Sometimes we can just have some things about our perspective that's off until we encounter someone who can challenge our thoughts, have conversations with us, and we just continue to grow and evolve.
I'm with you there. Yeah, I like that.
That sounded like womp, 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 womp to Rob.
I'm a hardcore gospel lover. I do love the gospel. I just think we get it wrong.
Girl, I was so highly medicated, I don't even know if you Oh, found my people.
What's up, my listening fam? You know what just happened, and it never gets old. It's the tiniest deal, but I'm telling you, and maybe I'm just a little punk, but I was approached by my daughter with a pickle jar. Dad, I can't open it. Mom's been trying for 5 minutes. William can't get it open. Please help. She hands it over, and just as she was about to tell me that it's probably going to take me a bit, pop was about as easy as opening mail. I just hand it back, nonchalant, but the immature middle school Joey that's always been there for quick access is flexing his muscles and strutting out of the room, maybe with a gangster limp. Is anyone feeling me? All right, I certainly hope you all are doing well. I got me some free mentoring from a smarty pants today on this episode who gets jazzed up about the same conversations I do. Her name is Dr. Tiffany Yecke Brooks. That sounds like how maybe a rich person would say yucky. That is so yucky. Anyway, she's author of Gaslighted by God, released a couple of years ago. Today, we're talking about a book releasing tomorrow, April the 16th, titled Holy Ghosted. You heard some clips from it right at the beginning of this episode. I hope you are jazzed up to hear this conversation as much as I am for you to hear it. All right, this is some new news, nothing huge, but hey, on the B-sides, first of all, you can get it for $5. Link is in the show notes. It's just an additional podcast feed. If you can't afford it, holler at your boy. Anyway, on the B-sides, I'm going to be taking my slow time over many episodes, my journey from as early as I remember to current day. My spiritual journey is what I'm talking about. For example, did you know my mom was a part of what they called spirit-filled prayer group in a Catholic church? And when she was pregnant with yours truly, her baby was prayed over and prophesied over that, get a load of this, I do huge and amazing things in ministry. Well, the jury is definitely still out on that one. But fast forward to when I was about 6. To this day, I think God communicated something to little Joey. Fast forward 20 years, the depth of despair when I had to consider what at the time felt like a huge possibility that them Calvinists were right. People go to hell and they didn't even have a chance not to. And my God is loving. All the way to current day post-deconstruction, at least the major parts, and I feel more excited about my faith than I ever have. I still feel lost a lot, but it's without the fear, and when I reflect on the disciples hanging with Jesus in person for 3 years and still not understanding, I'd say I'm in some daggum good company. I'm not only at peace with, but I'm overjoyed being a part of my church family of 20 years, even though my beliefs have shifted so much and not really in conjunction with the church fam. And I do have people inside and outside the church who see things similarly, and the ones that don't, we just have good conversation. And that wasn't always the case. I wasn't always at peace with that. It was hard changing so much, but now I realize the most important things like love, the need for one another, and different levels of true faith and the resurrection, hey, we're tracking. So anyway, B-sides, I'm excited about this. I've got a lot to share, and dare I say, I may even try and say some stuff to help you on your journey, maybe encourage you a little bit. All right, I love you, and here's Dr. Brooks.
All right, so Tiffany, Yecke, Brooks, it's awesome to have you on here. And so Florida State University, that's where you got your PhD?
That is correct.
So does that mean we're Seminole fan? Because you and I were just talking Green Bay Packer football.
Yes.
Seminoles?
Yes, for sure.
Gotcha. Did you notice the Clemson behind me? Probably not.
Oh, no, I didn't. But man, that's become such a great rivalry, though.
Hasn't it? It used to not be. It was always for Clemson fans. It's like, okay, well, let's see how bad we can get beat. Yeah. Now it's like, oh, man, this can be an actually good game. So
absolutely.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, I'm really challenged by trying to fit tons into this conversation because there's so many things I want to ask you. But I thought we'd have a little fun up front and let's let our listeners get to know you a little bit. My first question would be, what are some of your favorite things to do? Like, what do you do for fun?
Okay, well, this is such a dorky answer, and so I feel like I have to apologize.
It's a dorky question. It's a dorky question.
Okay, you know what? So. That's fair. No, I love writing. And so even though that's my job, prior to becoming a full-time author, I was a literature and writing professor. I just love writing. To me, it's life-giving. I do it for fun. I also love dogs. And so my daughter and I love to take our dog on walks, just art projects, doing, fun, crafty mom stuff, just anything fun and creative.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I feel the same way about podcasting. Honestly, my therapist even encouraged me. She was just like, I mean, are you sure you can consider podcasting your hobby? Because that's what you do full time also. But I would throw in, I was thinking I could have a dream job if I could review the books that I love reading and the movies I love watching. I could read books and watch movies. As long as I get a little exercise in, I can do that 24/7. And just that, oh my, I just love
dream.
Movies. Yeah, movies and books. And that takes us to books. Like, name one book in your life that left a mark on you, fiction or nonfiction. Any book.
David Copperfield.
Nice.
Oh, actually, I need a second one. Also, Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston.
Ooh.
Yes, those two.
So I went my recent books, and one of them, from a mental health perspective, The Worry Trick, was huge. I'm going to have to reread it a few times. I read it in one sitting because the words are so big. It was awesome. I was like, man, what is this, a children's book? But I zipped through that one. And then there's a book called Why We Sleep. Oh my gosh, you got to check it out. It's a New York Times bestseller, but it will revolutionize your perspective of sleep, and it will pretty much make you come to your grips and say, I got to get 8 hours. I mean, it's unbelievable what the body does in those 8 hours. It is
I should have added with the previous question, I do love a good nap. So that might be good bringing together of interests. Yeah.
Me too. And then there's a recent release, and this will be interesting because I'm curious where your theology is at, but I read a book called Holy Hell. It's brand new by a guy named Derek Ryam-Kabilis, and he was just on this show, and it's probably the best treatment, in my opinion, of a Christ-centric universal salvation. I mean, I feel like he covered all the bases philosophically, theologically, and then totally a book that most Christians would shudder at. But if you haven't heard of Sapiens, it's a big time book. Barack Obama, I don't know if he wrote the foreword or what, but it's basically a brief snapshot of human history. It's about 400 pages, but it is fascinating. And, obviously the guy's an atheist, so there's no God stuff, but still just the history. Super interesting stuff.
Yeah, I'm in my last semester of seminary, so my to read list is like massively growing of everything I haven't been able to, but Holy Hell is in that. So that's coming up for me very soon. I'm excited about it.
Nice. Do you have an app for your book stuff? I'll recommend Book Buddy is a real good one.
Oh, okay. Great.
So like anytime I see a book that I want to read, put it on there. Keeps track of all the books I've read. You didn't expect all these weird questions, did you? But this is
it's all. Hey, I'm here for the weird, man.
How about favorite movies? Just one of them.
Anything by Wes Anderson.
Nice. Yeah. Any favorites of his? Or
I mean, I love.
I'd say Royal Tenenbaums for me, probably.
That's good. Darjeeling Limited, I think, is probably up there.
How about music? What's your musical interests?
This is so embarrassing. I'm not
Patty,
really
Petra.
Not exactly. No, so I grew up in an a cappella tradition.
Oh, okay.
And so I never really got into contemporary Christian music because it used instruments. And so it was always a little bit suspect. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Wow. I've heard of traditions like that. That's super, super interesting. Especially there seems to be so many things in the Bible about instruments and stuff, but that'd be an interesting discussion. So I want to know, and make it a snapshot or as in-depth as you want. My goal is to fit all my questions, and I'm going to figure it out somehow, Tiffany. But give us a snapshot of your faith journey. How have you changed over the years? Where have you landed now?
Yeah. So I grew up in a tradition that's fundamentalist, but also at least where I grew up outside of DC, a lot of kind of evangelicalism in it too, because especially at the time that I was growing up, 80s and 90s, we were the DC area was sort of like Colorado Springs East.
Yeah.
So everything that came through, that was part of evangelicalism also came through DC.
Gotcha.
And so even in fundamentalism, there was some of that kind of mixed in. But I mean, I grew up and I describe it as it was a fairly normal church. Like we weren't going to end up on 60 Minutes or anything. But there are beliefs that either, you hear that are more extreme, or that sort of just from the overall soup of American Protestantism, kind of creep into your experience. And so, the tradition I came from, women could not be leaders in any way. So we had men's business meetings at the church. And it was interesting because just about a year or two ago, I thought, gosh, I haven't heard about, the church where I am now. I was like, I haven't heard about a men's business meeting in a while. And I was like, oh, because we just call them business meetings. Women are allowed to come and worry, our pretty little heads over the workings of the church, so just little things like that. And, a fish never asks what's water. And so for a long time, it just never even occurred to me to question things, or if they felt weird, it was always just sort of like, well, that's just the way things are. But one kind of major moment for me, and really everything, there wasn't one single turning point, but there were a few points along the way that kind of caused me to reframe. And one was when I was doing my postdoc. My husband is in the military and he was deployed overseas at the time. And our church was doing small groups. And the pattern we were following was that whatever couple hosted in their home that week, they would provide the meal and do the lesson. Well, a concern was raised when it was my turn to host as to who was going to teach the lesson, because my husband wasn't there. The added insult to injury to that was that it was a text that I had actually worked on in graduate school. But I was not, and not everyone felt this way, but there was some concern from some people that I was not qualified to teach it as a woman. That pesky uterus means you can't talk about Augustine, And so while that was going
the pesky uterus.
Right. But while that whole debate was going on, I was teaching the American novel or an American novel class, and we were doing The Sun Also Rises. And I remember standing in front of this lecture hall, speaking to these students, talking about how the title of The Sun Also Rises comes from the book of Ecclesiastes. And I had this moment where I just stopped and realized that I had more freedom to speak about my faith in my secular college classroom than I did in my own church.
Wow.
And that was sobering, because that was a moment where I was like, I can't choke down this cognitive dissonance anymore.
Yeah, something's the matter.
Something's broken here. Yeah. So that was a big moment. That was 2007, 2008. And then, I just went through the 2010s, a huge struggle with deconstruction, but I didn't have the language for it. It really wasn't something that was being discussed openly at that time. Like Rachel Held Evans was sort of just starting to creep into the awareness. So I didn't have the language. I didn't have the resources. Whenever I would, look up questions and try to find things, every answer was always like, well, if things aren't working out for you, then it's your fault. It's because of something you did and you aren't praying enough.
And Tiffany, I just want to honor you and everyone who went through that 15 years ago, because I've been able to ride on people's shoulders like you guys, because there was resources galore. So thank you for going through that in a very much more difficult era. So sorry for interrupting.
No, I appreciate you saying that, actually. Thank you. Because, yeah, it was rough. And, everything you read, it was sort of like, well, then you're not fasting enough. You're not praying enough. You aren't doing enough Bible study, whatever it was. And it all came back to you. So the first book that I wrote in this space was actually called Gaslighted by God. And the idea was reconciling the God of Scripture with the God of experience. Because I think a lot of us, especially those of us raised in literalist traditions, if God didn't align with the 66 books or our experience of God, then we were told, well, then you're experiencing God wrong. That was a major thing for me. And so that book came out. I started working on that in 2019. That book came out in 22. And one of the chapters in that book was looking at spiritual anxiety and abuse. And I had so many people reach out to me afterward and say, could you write more about that topic? Because that really hit me. And as somebody who grew up, and I describe some of my experience in Holy Ghosted of just in constant fear of I'm not praying enough. I'm not good enough. What if I sinned in the last 90 seconds? Yeah, that hit home. Like I thought, okay, maybe I'm not the only person who had this experience. Maybe I'm not the only person who felt this way. So that was really what led to Holy Ghosted. And sort of the premise of this book is that spiritual anxiety is a trauma response. Understanding that, how do we make sense of the environments from which we came, and how do we hold on to faith as we try to heal? And I think part of that is understanding the methods of manipulation that high control churches or authoritarian leaders, really rely on to keep people in this state of imbalance. Because if you can't trust yourself, then you're going to look to someone else to give you the answers. And so the system feeds the system.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let me give you, just so you know who you're talking to, and I'm going to make it very snapshot. It's just for you because my listeners have been on this journey with me on this podcast for about 10 years. So they've heard this 100 times. But my childhood, as I saw the innocence of it, was obliterated probably. I can look back at my childhood and I can almost feel when it tanked. And it was when we switched from a Catholic church. And obviously that's got its own baggage, but I guess I was so young and my parents were so new in their faith. It wasn't toxic, but we moved over to a Pentecostal church, what a shift there. And that's when the fear of hell started creeping in. And it was a place of some of my fondest memories, which is a total mine, what? Yeah. It's crazy. So I worked through a lot of stuff over the years. Hell, even the prospect of, when I was digging into theology, predestination, like, holy shit, like you mean to tell me that some people are going to go to hell and they don't even have a choice in the matter and they're going to be tortured forever. So my therapist really helped me see that, Joey, you were traumatized. Like that was a traumatic, ongoing deal that you experienced as a kid. And so me and a couple of buddies started a podcast called Bad Christian back in the day. And we just started it at the right time. There wasn't anything like it. And so it really took off. We had opportunities to talk to so many people. And that's when I really started to shift, because I started hearing really smart people who were just as interested in finding God's truth through the Bible and coming out with completely different things. And then I really started to see scripture in light of a universal salvation. And that is obviously something that a whole lot of Christians are not ready for. But my church, here's what's crazy, is my church family of like 20 years, they stayed with me, loved me through all the deconstruction, all of my cynicism. I went through a mental health crisis in 2019, which was really weird about that is all of the real irrational stuff that I worked through. I don't know if you've heard this term scrupulosity, but it's a real OCD, religious traumatic deal. All that stuff came back. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm starting to repetitively say the sinner's prayer. I'm starting to wonder if I'm cursed for life. I mean, it was just like all this stuff started coming back up. So through that ordeal, and then working with a therapist who, you know, a lot of people don't like how this sounds, but she's currently a Buddhist, but she understands my background. She respects my role as a pastor, and she understands the baggage. So she was extremely instrumental in helping me work through all that. So now I feel like I'm released from all the bondage. I'm released from all the trauma, and I'm with a church community who loves me as I am. And it's what's crazy is it's a mega church, and they've even entrusted me to do their podcast, produce it.
That's awesome.
I think a foundation of this conversation that I want to ask you is, aren't some of the traditional beliefs that we were taught when it comes to the narrative of hell, that stuff is just heavy in itself. So even though my theological views have really and truly shifted, I don't believe that anymore. I don't see how I could be healthy right now if that hadn't happened naturally, because the belief of people going to hell forever and ever and burning and seeing everybody in my world that I love in that narrative, I don't know how I could live healthy. And I don't know if that's just how I'm wired up to not be able to just go through my life and be okay with that. But don't you think some of the traditional beliefs are just almost too much to bear for some people?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you brought up the scrupulosity and OCD side, because I actually talk about that. I also have OCD. And one of the distinctions that I make in the book is that spiritual anxiety is separate from mental health. And so that can amplify it, and that can make it present in different ways. But even if you're not someone who has OCD or generalized anxiety or neurodivergence or of any kind, you can still experience this spiritual anxiety because of what your environment was. And I think hell is a huge part of that, because you think no one was born with a fully formed theology of hell. You know, this fear has to come from somewhere. This was somewhere in our environment. So the idea of spiritual anxiety that I come back to, and I talk a bit about a book that you look at scrupulosity, but it's a bit broader than just that. It sort of encompasses all these worries and fears of rejection by your community as well. This doesn't originate in our neurological wiring. It originates in our environment. And we have to recognize that this was something put upon us. This was done to us. And so, sorry, that's my background to go to your question.
No, I think that's just so important, because I lived in a world where that stuff wasn't doubted. That was the reality. Right. And if I did start to doubt, then I was in danger of going there.
Exactly.
So it's just like a damned if I do. I can't challenge this. I can't question it. So I've got to figure out how to be okay with this somehow. And I never could.
Yes, no. And I think that's such a challenge. Because we say we're not okay with it. We say we're horrified. And yet I personally, one time I heard a person stand up at a guest preacher at a church. They invited a man from the congregation to preach. And he said, do you ever feel discouraged sometimes that, your faithful living is not being rewarded by this, or you're not seeing, the fruits of that in your lifetime, and you see other people who are just sinners and they're reaping all the benefits. And he goes, but we can take comfort in the fact that we will not have to see them in the afterlife. And I just had this moment of, wait, so we're taking comfort in the fact that someone that we don't like is being sent to eternal that was my last Sunday in that church. Yeah. I couldn't do that, because the profound brokenness and discarding of human decency to embrace that kind of theology is terrifying.
Have you read Calvinists write theological stuff, basically saying to the glory of God, we should rejoice in the justified punishment. I'm like, who are you people? Like, do you know who Jesus is? Have you read one of his teachings?
Like, what would Jesus do? Like, look at your little bracelet. Is Jesus like, yay, my enemies are going to be in eternal torment? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And then love then is packaged as fire insurance of, well, the reason I'm browbeating you is because I want to save you from this. No, you're browbeating me because you want to be right. Like, that's not love. Love would be saying, hold on, would an eternal God really create this scenario? Mm-hmm. Let's look at that. That's love.
Right. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Right. Like, there's no way. Like, I am so convinced. And what's crazy is the people that I'm in fellowship with. So my experiences are a little bit different. I totally agree with you that a lot of people browbeat because they want to be right and they want control. I'm in fellowship with people who would love for hell not to be true. In fact, the founder of our mega church told me, I hope you're right. Like I really hope you're right, but there's no, heretic or whatever. But I mean, after really seeping myself into a lot of studies, like I'm even reading, like I'm not dodging the Bible here. Now I read the Bible a lot differently than I used to, but when I read the Bible now, I'm like, it seems plain as day. And I'll tell you one thing that I can never get over is the words that Jesus said on the cross. He said, Father, forgive them for they know not what they're doing. If Jesus says, when you see me, you've seen the Father, then he just demonstrated God's perspective of humanity. I want to forgive you because you didn't know. Like you couldn't see it as I wanted you to see it because there was a veil. My thoughts and ways are higher than yours. Forgiveness is what I want you all to have. Unless Jesus was just being cute, it seems like that's how God is.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting when you start studying, depending on how you slice it, there were probably 7 to 8 kind of schools in the early church of, groups of predominant philosophies throughout the Mediterranean. And, what scholars have found is that probably 6 of them definitely had some kind of universalism. 1 they're not sure on. And then there was Rome, which didn't. And then you look at which school of religious philosophy became supreme, and suddenly you start to understand how that thinking caught on. Mm-hmm. But this was not, it was by no means universal in the early church to believe in hell or this fiery torment that now we've built entire theologies on.
And wouldn't you say, one thing that you tackle in your book is, you talk about the dangers and how indoctrination, legalism, praise and fear and all that stuff is weaponized. Wouldn't you say if that narrative that we were taught is true, then the indoctrination and the fear is worth it? Do whatever you can to scare people to get them out of hell. Like if that's the reality, then I say my kids needed to be indoctrinated, and I need to tell them every single day, hey, you need to make sure you're good with God because you don't want to go to hell. If that stuff's true, then I think indoctrination is where we need to go.
If that's the case, then you're worshiping hell, not God.
Unpack that a little bit.
What is the reason for why you're doing any of that? It's hell avoidant. You're serving hell. That's what's at the forefront of your mind. That's your motivation. Mm-hmm. That's what's driving every decision. It's not God, it's hell.
Yeah.
So you're worshiping hell essentially at that point, because that's the driver of your religious instincts. That's what's motivating you, not love, not connection, but a fear of going somewhere you don't want to be.
So what about you? What do you think about all of this stuff? I've got tons of questions for the book, but before we move on, how have your views on salvation shifted? Would you put yourself in the same camp as myself, or where are you at with all of this?
Well, I grew up in a tradition again, and I don't want to sound like I'm picking on my tradition, but you know what you know, and that's what seems normal. And the tradition I grew up in, salvation comes at the moment of baptism. And so there was always the discussion, not confession, but the dunking under the water, and it had to be baptism by immersion. So there was always the discussion of, if somebody gets in a car accident on the way to be baptized, would they go to heaven or not? And for me to reach the point of letting go of the hair splitting, I heard one time, going back to Jesus on the cross, a preacher talking about the fact that he said, Jesus, for those of you who don't think baptism, is essential, they love to point to the thief on the cross where Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm going, okay, yes, where are we going with this? And he goes, well, there were people like John baptizing all over, Israel at that time. it's on you. The onus is on you to prove that that man hadn't been baptized. And I was like, you don't understand how burden of proof works, my friend. Like that's no.
Yeah.
But if that's what we're concerned with, and again, for me, just coming back to that idea of my theology is right, and so yours is wrong if we differ at all. It was always something that was always presented to me was, if you had a glass of water and there was 1 drop of arsenic in it, would you still drink it? And of course you would say no. And so it's like, well, that's what wrong doctrine is. That's what, and so that's why rightness matters, because otherwise you're drinking poison. And so,
those people would hate Jesus. Like,
yeah,
I don't think they realize that if you put them back in 28 AD or however the numbers work out, you would have hated Jesus. I mean, you would have listened to this guy that says the law says this, but I say that. You'd be like, crucify him. Like,
and if you notice,
we don't have any time for this.
Right. They tend to quote Paul a lot more than they quote Jesus.
Yeah. How important do you think the fact is in all of this is that the reality is we can't know exactly how everything shakes out, and we don't know. Like, don't you think that's super important for all of us to grapple with?
I think that's true for everything in the realm of faith. We can't know. That's what faith is, right? Like, faith is not knowing, yet our call is to do our best and to try to get as close to the heart of God as we can. And so I believe, I think one of the best examples is in C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle in the Narnia series, where you see Emeth from Calormene, and he's looking around. He says, I shouldn't be in Aslan's land because I spent my whole life worshiping our God. And Aslan says, yes, but everything that is good is of me. And so when you did something good, even if it was the name of this other God, you did it in my name. And so, like, to me, this idea of God is what is goodness, Christ is what is goodness. Either Christ died for all of humanity or he didn't. And so which one do you believe? I believe he did. And so I believe that that's where the reconciliation comes. And so, I mean, yes, there are finer points of theology to argue on all of it, but really when it comes down to it, I want the focus of my life and my theology and the trajectory of my spiritual journey to be in pursuit of goodness and love and God.
Yeah.
And that means saying, like, let's try to draw closer to God rather than run away from hell.
Yeah, and the thing is like, if we're onto something, and I truly believe that we are, think about the beauty of witnessing. Like, to tell someone, not hey, you need to make a decision and then you have access to a God that loves you, but hey, no matter what you do right now, no matter what kind of hell you're in, there's hope for you because there's a God that loves you. But bottom line is, no matter what you do, he's going to get his way in the end, and you're going to be perfectly loved forever and ever. So just know, my friend, there is hope for you. That idea is like, wait, you got to tell me more. Wait, you mean to tell me there's a God, the creator, loves me no matter what I do? Well, yeah. That, oh my gosh, that flips everything around, because no longer are we saying, but by the way, if you don't listen, this God's going to be really pissed off at you.
Right.
Almost. And one thing that the Holy Hell book opened my eyes to is just that makes God an abuser. God says, I want you to believe me, but if you don't, I'm going to punish you.
Right.
If you don't love me, I'm going to punish you. I mean, if you told me, Tiffany, that you're married to someone that says, hey, if you don't love me a certain way, I'm going to beat you, everybody would say you need to leave that guy. You got to get out of there.
That's something I talk about a bit in Gaslighted by God too, is this idea of many of us, what we have are actually trauma bonds with God. It's not actual love. It's a form of, trauma bonds are a form of Stockholm syndrome. For a lot of us, what our relationship with God has become not actual. And actually, come to think, I think I write about that in Holy Ghosted too, because I think that's so important, because for so many of us, that's what forged our concept of a relationship with God. That's an abusive relationship. I'm just saying this now without having thought this part through all before, but that's blasphemy.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. So with Holy Ghosted, tell people about the Radium Girl story. I think that brings some good insight.
Sure. So in the story that I open with, to kind of be the framing metaphor here at the beginning, in 1917, a factory opened in Orange, New Jersey for painting self-luminous watch dials. And it was for soldiers going over to World War I, for pilots. They needed something that could light up. And young women were hired to work in this factory, and they would paint this self-luminous paint onto these watch dials. And they were encouraged to do a practice known as pointing, where you would roll the paintbrush on your lip to bring it to a finer point so you could do that. And people were a little concerned about this glowing pigment, but they were told it's safe. And so the girls painted themselves in it, like they'd come out glowing. So they were nicknamed Ghost Girls. Sometimes they would even paint it on themselves because, they had been assured it was safe. Even after a study came out that said, actually, this may not be safe. And as if you're not already familiar with the story and you haven't guessed, that glowing pigment was radium. And so then on September 12th of 1922, a woman named Molly Maggia died at the age of 25. And for the past year, she'd been complaining of pain in her jaw. She was losing teeth. She had horrible growths on her body. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. And they kept running different tests. They put her on an aspirin regimen. And then they said, well, she must have syphilis. That's what it is. Even though there was no evidence of her having any kind of a, promiscuous lifestyle. And then it started happening to other young women in Illinois. Wherever these factories were, these women started developing these symptoms. A study came out and said, actually, this is dangerous. We shouldn't be doing this. But there were cover-ups, there were bribes, and it took, years of fighting in court for it finally to be recognized. And when the women in Illinois pointed to Molly Maggie and said, hey, we're concerned about this woman who died in New Jersey, they were told, well, she had, sexually transmitted diseases. That's what it was. Wow. And so, just don't do that and you'll be fine. But, as we know now, obviously it was all caused by the radium. So even now, 100 years later, if you run a Geiger counter over their graves, the numbers spike to astronomical levels because those women were so filled with this poison. I use that as the metaphor for this book that, people who speak openly about pain or doubts or questions, they are shamed, they're discounted, they could have their character disparaged, they're told they're ignorant, they have a weak faith, they have secret sin, whatever it is. And those who stay quiet are often applauded as glowing examples of, and, pun very much intended, of what, the Christian life is supposed to look like, even though it's killing them from the inside out, eating away at their emotional well-being. And so that is really the metaphor that I open the book with, that so many of us have been taught that, this is the path that's most pleasing to God. So we paint ourselves with the language and the practices of the abusers, and we, step out in the world and we're not radiating the Holy Spirit, but the very poison that's killing us.
Yeah.
And I want to be clear, and I go to great lengths in the book to make it clear that I'm not saying that this is all churches. I'm not saying this is all religious leaders. I don't see every pastor twirling their mustache and tying souls to celestial railroad tracks. That's not what I'm saying. But we know this is true. We know this happens. And when you say a leader, it doesn't even necessarily mean a pastor. It can be anyone exercising spiritual authority over someone else. This can happen in family structures. This can happen in organizations, ministries, wherever this is, wherever somebody is wielding this power over someone else that is intentionally keeping them out of balance in a place of that's killing them spiritually for the sake of someone else maintaining their own control, profit, power, benefit, whatever that is. And so that's the idea of the Radium Girls in the story. And I think it's important to have that lens and how we look at how this works in churches.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And that kind of touches on when you were talking about those that actually are the great examples that, kind of put us in a weird situation because we're not like that. Is that what you mean when you talk about the praise that's used for manipulation and control?
Yeah. So the chapter control through praise, that's one of the things we look at is, you're told, wow, look how much this person prays, how constantly this person's praying, how much this person exhausts themselves for the church, how much this person is burning themselves out for God. And so that can wear a person down. Of course, the church thrives on volunteers, and that's wonderful. And it's incredible that people have a heart for this. But very often people can feel like this is the only thing. This is the only way that God loves me. My worth only comes from the service, the way that I can basically be exploited on behalf of the church. And so they get praised for that and held up as an example. And that just kind of turns the screw a little bit farther and a little bit deeper to feed that thinking. And so, one of the things I do in the book is reframe a number of common biblical stories that we've, been told this story is about this, or this is what this means. And sometimes it's not, or sometimes it could be a yes, and, it also means something else, or, here's a detail that lens has caused us to read past or read over. And one of the things I talk about is
Can you give us 2 examples? Because I did want to ask you about that. I'd love to just hear an example or 2.
Well, so one is the Good Samaritan, and so that was always held up as an example of, this is somebody who just put everything on hold and just, poured themselves out for this person that they met on. Yes, that's great. I am in no way saying we shouldn't stop and help our neighbor in need. But if you notice, the Good Samaritan saw the person, stopped, helped them. Then they took them to an inn, ministered their needs, and then the Good Samaritan continued on his way. Right? And so he saw the person's need, matched that person up with someone who could meet that need, but he didn't cast his own responsibilities and obligations aside. And we know so often in ministry, families pay the price because, it's like, okay, well, I'm sorry I can't be a present parent, but I've got to go serve God. Or the Good Samaritan had boundaries.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good point.
It says he saw the need, he did minister to it. It is not, but then he continued on his way. So he had boundaries around pouring himself. And I think that's something that gets missed so often. Another one that I look at is the parable.
Real quick. And I think what's so important about that is, there's obviously, it seems like every 3 months, there's a big church with a big leader that falls. And Mars Hill, for example, I know a lot of people that were in that. And that's the big one, is they're just like, we sacrificed everything for this. Like we took on jobs that paid a lot less. We had an unbalanced life as a family because we thought it was all for God's kingdom. And it's like, then it blows up and they have to second guess, was it all for naught? And did we sacrifice everything for nothing? And that's a huge thing to work through.
So you have the Good Samaritan having boundaries, and yet he's still called good. And I think that's such an important detail that we read past because we've been programmed to read past it. And another one that I look at in that chapter, and this one gets a little more complicated, so it's going to be kind of hard to explain in a more concise way, but is the parable of the talent. Because that to me was always held up as, and so that's why you have to maximize every gift you've been given. You have to perform for God. Otherwise, you're the talent or the servant who buried the talent in the ground and you'll be cast out.
And you're lukewarm. God's going to spit you right out.
And so the thing to consider is when we read that story, to have that interpretation, God has to be the landowner. God is the powerful leader who does this. Except when you look at their other details, when has Jesus ever sided against the poor? And yet in this story, it is the poor individual who is chastised and cast out. You also see that it says, that the leader went to go gain power for himself. And so that is sort of a weird detail, especially when you consider that the story, Jesus tells the parable of, like in Luke, especially, you see in the parable of the talents, he goes to Zacchaeus' house. Zacchaeus says, I'm going to give half of everything I earn to, I'm going to pay that back, and more. The Pharisees are grumbling. And then Jesus tells this story where the person in power, suddenly we read that person as God, and the moral of the moral of the parable is supposed to be, so earn money, so create more. Like that's antithetical to everything we just saw in Zacchaeus. What's more is that Jesus leaves, gets on the donkey, weeps over Jerusalem, and then the next thing that happens is overturning the money changers' tables at the temple. Once again, stop monetizing things, stop commodifying people. So to have the parable of the talents sandwiched between these two stories about stop trying to accrue power and material blessings, stop trying to hold on to power, stop trying to commodify people, maybe we need to read the parable of the talents a little differently. And this is where my training as a literature professor comes in. Thematically, the way we traditionally read it does not fit in terms of where it's actually positioned in the text. But if you read it as the Pharisees are the landowner, and that they're actually praising the people who are going out and exhausting themselves on behalf of acquiring riches for them, for the temple, for whatever, it takes on a whole new meaning. It takes on a whole new significance that maybe fits a lot more organically in the story when you consider where it's positioned in the narrative of Jesus's life between these stories about let's stop accruing things, let's give back, let's not cast out the poor.
Right.
And so
with your literature background, are you ever baffled by the concrete theology we make about the afterlife from Jesus's words?
And yet we've made it, an absolute, a binary in our faith conversations and our theologies. And there's a lot there.
Yeah. So I want to tell you about my daughter, and something that I've been working through is when I really started going through my major deconstruction, it was kind of during the season that I really had foreseen me being able to really bring them up in the right way, teach them and all that. And I realize now that a lot of that stuff would have been done poorly anyway, but I don't like the fact that through a huge chunk of time, I just didn't know what I believed. I was very scared just in general. And so I was not interacting with them a lot when it came to spiritual stuff. Well, we found out, so my second oldest daughter is turning 16, and we found out, and it's actually a dear friend of mine who helps me host on this show as well. She still believes in the heaven and hell narrative, and I get it. I understand where she's coming from. But when she was teaching my daughter as like a 7 or 8 year old, she brought that up, and we did not know. But for about 2 years, Gwenny started going in the same direction I was going in as a child, with the crazy, fearful, repetitive prayers, and just constantly in mental turmoil. Yes. And when we found that out, I was able to, talk her through all of that stuff. And I'm just so thankful that I knew that was going on, because this stuff crippled me for a super, super long time. I wanted to circle back to what you were saying as far as people who aren't wired up necessarily with struggles of anxiety or depression and that sort of stuff. How can the trauma of the scrupulosity and all these things that we're talking about, how is that kind of a separate thing? Because I've seen it really weaved through my predisposition to worry and depression. And I think that I've kind of categorized it as, hey, this has always been like the most important thing in my life is being okay with God. So because I struggle with depression and anxiety, that's kind of my go-to. That's that's what's going to rock my world, sort of thing. Yeah. But how do you see the two as kind of separate?
Well, so, and again, I'm that way myself. But what I found in interviewing people for this book, because I have interviews woven throughout the book from people from a variety of Christian backgrounds, was there were so many people who did not have those traits. And so what a trauma response is when your brain reacts in a way. So we know the fight, flight, fear, or fawn response, right? Run away, try to battle them, try to make yourself invisible, or try to appease the attacker. And so we know that the brain dips into that when it feels threatened. That's just a biological response. A trauma response forms when we dip into that response, even if we're not being physically threatened. And in fact, it can happen when we operate, when we find ourselves operating at that heightened fear level all the time. That was only ever meant to be a temporary response to get us out of a dangerous situation. But when you are in an environment that is imbued with fear and indoctrination and authoritarianism, you can't ever step out of. It's very difficult to move yourself out of that constant state of being on alert. So then this adaptive response that was, supposed to only be temporary becomes permanent. That becomes your baseline. And so now everything is filtered through that kind of response. And so that's where trauma responses come from, where you see the people pleasing and you see often like reliving horrible images in your head over and over, which I get talking about hell, like that's a big one. Like who hasn't had the scary hell dreams or the rapture dreams and you weren't taken or whatever that was, And so spiritual anxiety is a trauma response. Our brains, our emotional center, our spiritual life's response to living in a heightened state of survival all the time so that we don't know how to, maybe you have a sermon that really got you. Like, that's okay. That's a big thing that I talk about is that spiritual anxiety is not healthy religious devotion. It's not normal feelings of regret or repentance or desire to do right. It's okay to be convicted by a sermon that really speaks to you. What's not okay is to be in a place of constant conviction so that you never feel peace with God. You never feel like you can breathe. You never feel like you are worthy of God's love or that you may not be rejected. It's always living on that edge. And so you see things like unwelcome intrusive thoughts and pervasive doubts about your own salvation, perfectionism, extreme literalism. And a lot of times this can look like aggressive evangelism, right? Because if you're scared, one of the responses is, well, they'll lean into it harder and then go out and I'll preach that much harder so I can, overcome this. Or again, that perfectionism, that if I get praise, it means that I'm okay. And then maybe I'm worthy of God's love.
That helps me humanize the street corner preacher who tells people you're going to hell if you think of him or her as a fearful person themselves. Wow.
Yes. And that's something else that I talk about in the book is the fact that so often the things we see being modeled in churches are as much an example of that person's or that context's anxieties as they are our own. Because they're going to lean into whatever it is that worries them most. And that's what they rail against.
Wow. All right. So here's what I'm going to do. And sorry that I've interrupted you a bunch. Hopefully I haven't ruined your train of thought, but people are just going to have to get the book if they want to hear you go in depth with this stuff. I'm going to ask probably about 5 questions and we're going to tackle them in like 6 or 7 minutes. So I'm telling people ahead of time, these are some questions that merit way more discussion than what we're going to give it. But I want to touch on the difference between deconstructing faith and deconstructing.
Yeah. Deconstructing faith. And I think I talk about this in chapter 2, maybe deconstructing faith. You're looking at the traditions that you inherited. Deconstructing God. You're questioning whether there is a God, whether any of this matters. And so I think a lot of times in conversations, deconstruction gets, it's this big boogeyman right now because people are like, well, people just don't want to believe in God at all. No, there's a difference. And some people are breaking down one and some people are breaking down the other. And this book is designed for primarily people who are deconstructing their faith, but not necessarily God.
Gotcha. How do people carry? I like how this was worded. And I just want to read this too, because this was just a breath of fresh air, how this was said: seeking truth fearlessly and loving God and neighbor without restraint or fear. That sounds so good. How can readers carry on the work of walking with God while dealing with their own spiritual anxiety? I mean, that's kind of what we've been talking about the whole time, but the concept of God being a part of that process.
Yeah. So throughout the book, each chapter opens with an example from or a passage from a different piece of classical literature to kind of create a metaphor, help us, create a little of separation between ourselves, because these things are so close to us that it's difficult to discuss them sometimes or examine them honestly because they're so deeply ingrained in who we are. So that distance helps to set things up. And so in the final chapter, one of the things we look at is in the Brothers Karamazov, where Dostoevsky, one brother is trying to convince another one that there is no God. And he says, well, how do you explain the fact that, there's this little 5-year-old girl and her parents are horrible abusers, but they're all she knows and they shove filth in her mouth. But at night, she cries out to God, because she's heartbroken. He's like, how could a good God allow that? But the point is, this child this is the only reality she knows. She doesn't know life can get better. And yet her soul is still crying out because something in her inherently recognizes that something is wrong here. The soul cries out when something is incongruous with the heart of God. And the sad thing is often we don't see when we're being abused in a system. But if you notice this spiritual anxiety, if this is something you've detected in yourself, this is Romans 8:26, where the Spirit cries out, it intercedes in those groanings too deep for words. This is a sign not that God has abandoned you. This is a sign that the Holy Spirit is truly alive and active in you, because it is recognizing something is desperately wrong here. And so I want the person who's struggling with this to take reassurance that these questions and doubts and wrestlings are actually the Holy Spirit at work, or a sign that the Holy Spirit is at work in you and you have not been abandoned, and it is recognizing, it is calling your attention to the fact that your environment is broken. And so rely on that, lean on that. We're told seek God, and that may mean leave the environment that you're in. You know, why seek the living with the dead? That's a key question the angel asks at the tomb, but that's a question we could be asking ourselves. If we are in a church where this abuse is happening, we're probably not going to find Christ there.
Because who the sun sets free is free.
Is free. Yes.
Right.
So let's seek Christ among the living.
How about involuntary internalized legalism?
Ooh, that's a big one. That's one of my favorites in chapter 4. We talk about that.
We're going to give you 10 seconds on that one. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, so basically, no, but that's the idea that rather than legalism putting the burden on someone else, which is external legalism, involuntary internalized legalism means that we hold ourselves to a higher standard. And you basically get trapped by your own conscience. And then you can no longer trust yourself. And a lot of faiths or a lot of denominations or church traditions, unfortunately, have the toxic premise of shaming the intuition out of people and say, you can't trust your emotions. You can't trust yourself. Y'all, trusting your gut is not the same thing as trusting in the flesh. But for so many of us, and I'm going to go ahead and say, especially for women, that is something that we were taught, that was reinforced to us. Don't listen to your emotions. But what that does is it makes you unable to trust yourself. So then you look to that external leader. But if you can't trust yourself, then you're going to ignore every bit of intuition when it tells you this is not right. You know, because involuntary internalized legalism, you can recognize this is ridiculous. And I know this is taking it too far. And yet it's that flipping almost over to superstition, like you were talking about. But I want to keep repeating it because just in case, because if I don't, then I get panicked. I have a whole chapter looking at how to understand what that is and how that works. And how to try to work with that as you move forward.
Yeah, it feels like it's presented as an all or nothing. Maybe it's that sometimes we need to rethink whether or not our thoughts are okay and maybe doubt. And then other times we should be like, no, you know what? I really think that this is on. Like, this is right. Like, maybe sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. But you're right. I mean, I was taught, you can't trust yourself. You're sinful. Like you
right.
If you're doubting, don't ever trust that. And it makes for a very stagnant, scared faith.
Yes. Your intuition isn't always going to be right, but it's not a sin to listen to your intuition and to try to protect yourself from abuse or harm. That is not sinful.
What are some different types of rhetorical fallacies that you discuss?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I look at things like the fallacy of composition, which is where a small part of something is presented as representing the whole. So like we talked about deconstruction, people will say, well, deconstruction, everybody who's deconstructing just wants to burn down the church and destroy That's not true, but that's the fallacy of composition. You have an ad hominem attack where you attack the person in an effort to discredit their argument, even though, that's not how that works. Begging the question, that the whole, so have you stopped cheating on your taxes thing? The appeal to tradition of, well, this is the way it's always been done. Okay, well, maybe not, or maybe we've always been wrong. The straw man argument, where, you turn your opponent into a caricature. And so then it seems like the only logical approach is to refute whatever they say. That's a big one that's used. Reductio ad absurdum, where you take something to you bring it down to its most ridiculous conclusion. And that's kind of related to slippery slope as well. If A leads to B and B leads to C, then clearly A is going to lead to Z. And that's why you can't do any of this. So those are just some of the rhetorical fallacies we look at.
Gotcha. Love this. Hey, what can you, I was reading how you are a speaker for student groups, faith conferences. What kind of crazy student leaders let you around to pollute their little minds and with heresy? Like, are these churches that are a little bit more open-minded to different ways of looking at the Bible, sort of?
They are, and that's what's wonderful is there are a lot of ministries that are recognizing church trauma is real, or recognizing that, we need to do better than we've done in the past. And so I've had a Baptist college, I've had some Church of Christ colleges, I've had, more conservative denominations invite me to come in and speak about these issues. I've had churches come in and say, talk to us about what this healing looks like. Like because that's the thing. The book is ultimately about healing. I don't want this to be a trauma dump. And I don't say that lightly because people do need to be able to share their traumas, but I don't want somebody to read the book and leave it feeling like, well, that was horrible and depressing and everything's wrong. Like, this book is designed to facilitate healing and hope in the reader. Not in an optimistic, toxic positivity way, but just in a way of saying, let's understand this so that you can get to a place that's healthier.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Brooks, this has been awesome. And thank you so much for sharing. This has been a great one for me personally. That's one of my favorite reasons to podcast is gives me an excuse to connect with people that are super, super helpful for me personally to hear from. So I appreciate it from a personal level and just for your time for our listeners.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for the work you do. I appreciate it.